Welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning from wherever you're joining us. A warm welcome to our event, Power Over Rights, Understanding and Countering the Transnational Anti-Gender Movement, which we, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, are co-hosting together with the German Federal Foreign Office and the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. My name is Nina Bernarding. I'm one of the co-founders of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. We are a research, advocacy, and consulting organization that promotes an intersectional feminist and people-centered approach to foreign policy. We believe that foreign policy can and should be a mechanism for equality, justice, peace, and solidarity. In early 2020, we've started to research anti-gender actors, their strategies, narratives, and connections. And for our study, we had the opportunity to interview dozens of activists, researchers, and politicians, and to discuss the topic with some of you during our expert roundtables in October. Now, today, we are beyond excited to share the final product of our work, the study Power Over Rights, Understanding and Countering the Transnational Anti-Gender Movement, which is now accessible on our website. This work would not have been possible without the support by the German Federal Foreign Office and the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and we very much appreciate the support. We are also incredibly grateful for all the researchers and activists who have agreed to talk to us, despite often very desperate circumstances. Building on the work of so many civil society actors, we hope that our study contributes to advancing the debate about anti-gender actors, in particular from a policy perspective. And before we start, I just would like to make one point. The debate about anti-gender actors is not a policy or an academic debate, but it's a development that renders many women and LGBTQI people around the world insecure, today and tomorrow. Many of the activists, in particular, we've spoken to for the study, highlighted that their situation or the situation in the country or in the context that they're working in is worse than it has been in a very long time. They're doing their best to defend the ground they have so painstakingly gained over the last decades, but fear that they're losing this battle. And we hope with this event, we can contribute to advancing this debate and to support the activists all over the world who are actually doing their best to protect and advance the rights, our rights, but also the values of our democracies. So how will today's event look like? In a minute, I will hand over to Michelle Müntefering, State Secretary of the German Federal Foreign Office and CFFB Advisory Council member. And then to Johanna Sumuvuori, State Secretary in the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. My colleague Damian Denkowski will then walk you through some of our findings of our study before we enter into a brief panel discussion on the anti-gender actors in Hungary and Brazil with our experts Denise Herrero and Bea Sandor. We will then open the floor for questions and comments. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand, or alternatively, you can write a question in the chat. We will end by 4:30 Berlin time. The event is a public one, and it will be recorded and will later publish on our website. And now it is my great pleasure to hand over to Michelle Müntefering. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nina. Dear Nina, dear Christina, excellencies, I can say, dear Johanna, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. There is no doubt about we are facing currently a strong backlash on gender rights, and that backlash is even getting worse by the corona pandemic. Some see COVID as a welcome pretext to undermine what we have achieved in decades. Of course, it is true, attacks on gender rights are by no means something new. When the Beijing platform for action was formed 26 years ago, many didn't want to accept that women's rights are human rights. And let us remember, back then, the adoption of Resolution 1325 was adopted in unity, but it was followed by strong anti-gender protests as well. But today something has changed. The anti-gender movement has increasingly started to build powerful transnational alliances. What used to be single voices has now developed into a strong and well-organized movement, and it is constantly gaining ground, particularly on social media. Its main targets are the women's rights, LGBTI rights, and civil society. And the fiercest battle is fought over sexual and reproductive health and rights. It is crucial to understand the structure and the strategy of this movement, because it is directed not only against gender rights, but against everything we believe in. First of all, human dignity, democracy. My big thanks, therefore, go to the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy for conducting the study Power Over Rights. Its results are indeed worrying. The anti-gender movement is highly organized and well-founded. It is part of a larger anti-democratic movement, and it has put human rights defenders under increasing pressure. These findings show that it is all the more important to stand up for gender equality on the national and regional level and in multilateral fora. I call upon states, multilateral institutions, civil society, movements, and individuals. Let us together push back this pushback, and let's support each other. For the German government, I can assure you, together with like-minded partners such as Finland, we will uphold and reinforce our efforts in supporting women's and LGBTI rights organizations. We are convinced that supporting civil society is defending gender equality is a matter of justice and democracy, but also of social peace and stability. And that is why we have also integrated support and protection of women's rights and LGBTI organizations in our third action plan on women, peace and security. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we are at crossroads. The emergence of the anti-gender movement is a strong reminder. Progress is no natural development. History is made by us. It is upon us to decide how our future looks like. The anti-gender movement has gained ground, but at the same time, there are so many people out there who are not willing to give in. And in November, I invited women from around the world to a digital women's night, and the message of this gathering was clear. We now have the unique opportunity to build back better after the COVID-19 pandemic. We can make this year we can make this year a turning point, for example, by adopting national legislation in order to guarantee gender equality, making tangible progress in the implementation of WPS, and securing more support, funding, and protection for civil society organizations. And this is no utopia. It is plain and simple a matter of political determination. I'm right by your side, and I thank you very much to all of you who are with us in this battle, in this fight for human dignity, for democracy, for women's rights. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your continued support. As I said, we couldn't have done it without Germany and Finland's support, so thank you so much, and we're looking forward to continue fighting with you. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to Ms. Johanna Sumowori. And yeah, Michelle, I don't know when you need to leave, but we know you're busy, so.
No, I'm here.
Okay,
of course,
okay.
I want to listen to Johanna.
Okay.
By the way, hi to Finland. Good to see you again.
Dear State Secretary Michelle, great to see you again, this time in online form, and dear participants. It's my great pleasure to be here with you in this virtual gathering in the midst of a busy week of the Commission of Status of Women. And there are important synergies between this study and the priority theme of this year's CSW as well. Women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence for achieving gender equality. So it's a great pleasure to be here and share some views on Finnish approach to this very important topic. When I first heard about the study of power over rights, understanding and countering the transnational anti-gender movement by the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, CFPP, I felt it was not only pertinent and necessary, I thought it was also an indispensable contribution towards a better understanding of the expanding anti-gender movement and thinking and action as a phenomenon in itself. At the moment, we are witnessing and the strengthening of the anti-gender movement in the international fora, unfortunately, including the EU and the UN. And this poses a serious risk to the advancement of women's and minority rights. Instead of even unintentionally generating any kind of further polarization or confrontation, I wish to stress the need to go to the roots and deep structures of the anti-gender phenomenon. In general, the more we build our policies and actions on evidence and research, the better policies we may achieve. For Finland, gender equality and the empowerment of women have been our high priorities for a long time. Day after tomorrow, on 19th of March, we'll fly the flag to celebrate gender equality and its Finnish forerunner, Minna Canth. She was a true activist of her own times, fighting for gender equality as a writer and a novelist, as an independent businesswoman, as an influencer, and a firm believer in the education of girls in the 18th century. However, still 124 years after her death, gender equality deserves special attention both in Finland and worldwide, especially due to the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, which State Secretary Montefiore was also mentioning. The pandemic has had a disproportionately severe effect on women and girls, especially on women and girls in vulnerable situations. We need to identify and work on the structures sustaining or allowing gender inequalities, as well as on harmful gender stereotypes, in order to build back better and more gender equal. In this work, we must remember that inequalities exist both online and offline. The gender digital divide needs to be bridged worldwide. These are also Finland's priorities in the groundbreaking generation equality process. And in broad terms, education is a key factor, including continuous lifelong learning. As the report to be launched today refers, the anti-gender phenomenon or movement is not just about women or gender, to reflect a bit what State Secretary Montefiore already said. It goes against many values and principles that are central to us, like, for example, democracy. Online violence and harassment are real threats to democracy because they hinder women and girls' participation. In a large scale, the anti-gender movement is about undermining the rule-based international order and multilateral cooperation, as the agreed results of both tend to be systematically questioned. The anti-gender movement is also against human rights, as it fiercely objects women's and girls' rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, and also the rights of the LGBTQI people. It is about discrimination and about multiple and intersectional discrimination, as it revolves around denying access to services which affect different ethnic, social, minority or disabled groups disproportionately. Instead of fostering a civil society which is at its best, it's vibrant, heterogeneous, multi-voiced and inclusive, the phenomenon is known to encourage exclusive and fundamentalist forms. As a general rule, we all, as conscious human beings, need to be careful and respectful with the language we use. Whilst the anti-gender movement represents a systematic attack on liberal values and the achieved advancements in the field of gender equality, we need to avoid being paralyzed. On the contrary, we must be firm, consistent, and coherent in our words and actions. As we have our challenges in Europe too, I stress the credibility starts at home. Finland has recently published both a gender equality action plan as well as action plan for combating violence against women. We are working on a government report on gender equality and conducting a study on the impact of COVID-19 on gender equality, as well as preparing our fourth action plan on women, peace and security. But still, much remains to be done and improved, both home and globally. Even in the eyes of a female-led government, like in Finland right now, our world is far from perfect. In our campaign to join to the UN Human Rights Council for the term 22-24, gender equality and the rights of women and girls is one of our priorities. I wish to stress that if only perfect performers were allowed to defend human rights, which are also girls' and women's rights, very, very few governments or states could speak up. All efforts are needed, small and big, home and abroad. The ownership of the study launched today belongs to the CFFP solely, and we governments do our best to respond to the recommendation presented. I commend the work done. I also wish to express my special thanks to the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, as well as to my German counterpart, Michel Münteferi, with whom I have had excellent interaction before on these topics, and also for the participating along the way with this study. And I trust the study will be a source of timely exchanges, hopefully constructive and forward-looking ones. For example, how to prove more proactive rather than reactive in our countermeasures towards anti-gender actions. And furthermore, I'm much looking forward to be able to get the study debated more widely back in Finland at a later stage. So thank you again. And let me conclude by saying that I'm very happy that I have this opportunity, and let's keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And yeah, we're looking forward to continue working with you and your colleagues. We've received really great support also from your end. And thank you also for highlighting in your remarks the pandemic and the wider anti-democratic environment that the anti-gender actors work in, as well as the interlinkage between domestic and foreign policy. And I mean, these are all points that we also touch up on our study. So thank you so much. It's now my pleasure to hand over to my colleague Damian Benkowski, who will present you with some of the main findings of our study. Having said this, on our website, you will find the study, but you will also find an executive summary and key takeaways in case you don't have the time to read. I think now it's 60 pages in the end. So yeah, Damian, please.
Thank you, Nina. Hello, everyone, and hello from my side also. I'm very happy and very proud to be able to present the findings of our study, Power Over Rights, Understanding and Countering the Transnational Anti-Gender Movement to today. I would start with a bit of structure just to give you an idea of what the presentation will look like. We'll talk about the study, its background and its purpose, and then moving on to looking at what we're actually dealing with and what the origins are of anti-gender discourse, then trying to take a look at the actors, what issues they mobilize against, what narratives they deploy, which strategies they use, and what we can do about it finally. In the study itself is published in 2 volumes. So volume 1 analyzes the anti-gender movements themselves in part 1, and in part 2 we look at lessons learned from successful movements around the world and then present recommendations to progressive governments and civil society. In volume 2, we've compiled the excellent case studies that we commissioned for this report on the United States, on Mexico, on Brazil, on the EU and the MENA region. The study itself was developed in the framework of the project Fighting International Pushback on Women's Rights, financially supported, of course, by the German Federal Foreign Office and the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. In writing the study, we built extensively on analyses of anti-gender campaigns in Europe and Latin America, a lot of scholarship analyzing the history of SRHR and women's rights internationally, and we conducted many interviews and did desk research on our part. In framing the ingredients for success for movements defending and advancing these rights, we learned a great deal from the Together for Yes campaign in Ireland, and we're particularly grateful to Alva Smith from the movement there, who took the time to walk us through their lessons learned in our preparation of the study. The purpose of the study and its aim is to support progressive actors to better understand the anti-gender campaigns and to support them in identifying ways on how to advance and defend these rights further internationally. And we also aim to close the policy gap, because we noted that there's much research on the anti-gender movements and what they do and how they work, but the policy perspective we found to be missing, and that's what we hope our study fills today. As a bit of background, the study itself was prompted by recent developments internationally and nationally. So we have seen massive mobilizations either in the street or municipalities or even in the UN Security Council of actors aiming to restrict and roll back women's rights and the rights of LGBTQI people, and they're also gaining ground. So at the same time, progressive actors have, while slowly, are becoming increasingly aware of the problem and developing ways on how to respond to the anti-gender movements. The problem with the response by progressive actors so far has been the assumption of an unstoppable progress or almost a teleological understanding of this process of development of human rights, and that they cannot be taken away. And for that reason, we feel that the pro-gender actors have generally failed to seriously engage with the threat that the anti-gender movement presents, and our findings conclude that the threat continues to be underestimated, because studies have shown that these rights internationally follow norm life cycles that lead to their institutionalization later in the international norm. So we must be aware of the conditions under which certain achievements have been made so that we can develop effective strategies to defend and advance them. Next slide, please. And one more, sorry. Thank you. So what are we actually dealing with? And I'm very happy that both state secretaries picked up on this, that we're not actually dealing with something that can be classified as a simple pushback. It is not merely reactive, it is very much proactive, and it is about power in the perceived decline of the power of the patriarchal system over the world order. So in that sense, they're advancing an alternative understanding of the world order, one where the rights of certain groups can take precedence over the rights of others. And here, a great example to explain this is the establishment of the Unalienable Rights Commission by the Trump administration in the United States, which took as its mandate to preclude references to any rights as codified in the UN or other mechanisms after 1948. This, of course, includes reproductive rights. And they argue that the principle of subsidiarity that is inherent in the Declaration of Human Rights gives states a lot of discretion in how they interpret and implement these universal principles. So in this way, this approach justifies both this regressive understanding of human rights that aims to curtail the rights of political minorities, and it rejects international oversight over the implementation by states of these rights. So in this way, these alternative institutional structures aim at making the point that gender and sexuality have nothing to do with human rights even, or that human dignity cannot be taken away by a state entity. And this elaboration very much erases the real impact of gender-based violence, whether through policies or society, on lived experiences and the existential threat that is then experienced by women and LGBTQI populations. And all of this is to be understood within the general context of decline in freedom. We have seen for several years, for instance, a decline in freedom worldwide, and backsliding regimes often promote state projects to enforce heteronormative or patriarchal family models, and they aim to curtail reproductive rights while being strongly opposed to the rights of sexual minorities. In parallel, the space for civil society is also shrinking. Since 2012, over 100 laws have been passed which aim at restricting funding, operations, and the registration of civil society organizations across the world. And these are harmful, especially to the rights and freedoms that depend on an active civil society for their defense and advancement. And these are very much the rights of women and LGBTQI people, especially in contexts where those in power are opposed to these rights. For instance, in the case study on Mexico, the author there points out how the traditional defenses of human rights, which are the NGOs, academia, decentralized state institutions who are tasked with human rights, often struggle to counterbalance the narratives on gender by the new administrations due to restricted access to funding that they have. Another element that is important to keep in mind when understanding what we are dealing with here is the way in which anti-gender movements overlap with right-wing populism. We often see overlapping actors and we often see overlapping language. The appeal of gender ideology for right-wing populists appears to be the possibility it provides to bind together various actors who do not share the same ideological strand across these issues. And we'll get back to this in a moment as well. It is the same pattern of defining the other and then blaming the other or assigning blame to the other for problems experienced by the in-group. But at the same time, it's important to know that we have right-wing populists who do not embrace anti-gender rhetoric, but actually actively go against it and focus on their support for women's rights and LGBTQI rights. The problem is that these are often juxtaposed with the perceived values of, for example, Muslim immigrants, which we can see during the fallout of the sexual assaults in Cologne in 2015 in Germany, where they frame xenophobic points in feminist language. At the same time, actors of the left have joined forces with anti-gender campaigns. For example, the current president of Mexico, López Obrador, ran together with the evangelical party Encuentro Social, which is an anti-gender actor in itself. So there's a lot of overlap, but they're not one and the same, and we cannot look at them as being one and the same. We need to look at them differently. There has been, it's also interesting to know that since the 2000s, we have a new generation of anti-gender campaigns, and this is something that also the both state secretaries picked up on. So in the last 20 years, we see an increasingly transnational nature of their activities. We see a growing capacity to mobilize on the streets and also within national multilateral institutions, and we see an ability to connect these processes together. And we will now in the next slide look a little bit more into the actors and how they're classified here. We use the classification provided by David Paternotte and Roman Kuchar, so we divide them into three groups: the old, the new, and the allies. So within the category of the old actors, we have actors who have existed before the 2000s and are in many cases very well established within domestic but also international politics. This includes anti-abortion groups or family groups, men's and fathers' rights groups, far-right and religious organizations, conservative think tanks, and faith-based professional organizations such as the Catholic Medical Association. The Catholic Church remains one of the main actors in this group, and they continue to be a main actor for as a main diffusion and mobilization network. Interviews and research conducted for this study demonstrated that the initiatives at the multilateral are very often driven and initiated by the Holy See or Christian countries and are occasionally joined by other faith groups. And here I would take a bit of a side note to talk about the Catholic Church's role in developing the concept of the gender ideology. Dale O'Leary, who is a US Catholic close to the Opus Dei and an anti-choice activist, is often regarded as the first person who has referred to gender as an agenda or ideology. And this was done with a view of explaining what had happened at Cairo and Beijing in 1994 and 95. So picking up on these ideas from the US Christian right, and then internationalizing them, she criticized radical feminism, and her ideas presented a kind of condensed, accessible narrative about what happened and provided a political framework that would allow for analyzing these events. And the labeling of gender as an ideology was then later incorporated into documents by the Vatican and displaced the previous culture of death as the framework for understanding the threat by progressive actors. And at this point, the concept of gender ideology has become prevalent and very much normalized. We'll also get back to this a little bit later as well. The new group includes civil initiatives and concerned citizens groups, new think tanks, institutions such as La Manif pour tous and all its followers across Europe. Many of these movements around the world adopt the same visual or brand identity. They use the same slogans, they use the same arguments, they often exchange speakers and prominent figures. And their key characteristic of these new actors is their ability to mobilize beyond the original religious confines of anti-gender activity and organize these mass demonstrations with a very much secular public, making it much more kind of center. The group also includes centers for conversion therapy, various government-operated NGOs, political parties, etc. And under the group of allies, we have academics or media who provide space and shape rhetoric, and also political parties who are there either for opportunism or ideology. And so looking at all of these actors, they're extremely diverse, and in most cases, they do not share the same ideological frameworks. Their motivations to enter either drive or support anti-gender campaigns also vary quite strongly. So the ability of the concept of gender ideology to squeeze all of these different discourses into one big threat and construct gender or gender ideology as an attack on at least one, on the nation, normality, or nature is allowed by the concept of gender ideology, which has come to signify in a way the failure of democratic representation, or opposing this ideology has become a means of rejecting the different facets of the current socioeconomic order in the face of perceived decline of traditional values. So next slide, please. When looking at the actors, one of the really important things is the funding. And here, one of the reports by Open Democracy recently found that 28 US Christian right groups, including the Heritage Foundation and other organizations with ties to the former Trump administration, among others, have spent at least $280 million outside of the US in the last 14, 15 years. The largest share of this money went to Europe and mainly channeled through two organizations, the American Center for Law and Justice, through their European branch, the European Center for Law and Justice, and the Alliance Defending Freedom. Both of these organizations have consultative status at the United Nations. The European Center for Law and Justice has intervened in at least 2 cases to defend Italy's position against gay marriage. It has intervened on behalf of Poland as well, defending their policies against divorce and abortion, for instance. They have really good funding and a really good ability to mobilize and diffuse messages because of this. In comparison, only 1% of gender-focused aid went to women's organizations in 2016 and 2017. The median budget for 740 women's organizations over the globe was a very low US $20,000. And 99% of foundation grants and official development assistance does not actually reach feminist movements and women's rights organizations. It's often given to international organizations or governments, which means that on the progressive side, we have the problem of the focus of enabling civil society to treat the symptoms of a system that systematically fails many groups, but there's very little funds to invest in advocacy to change or influence political and public discourse, which is a sign of the continued underestimation or misunderstanding of the threat being posed. Next slide, please. And so what do they mobilize against? As has been said before, not against gender or rights. They mobilize against perceived decline in power. So we have identified 4: gender as a concept, LGBTQI rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and sexuality education as kind of groups of issues that have been framed as the problems of the anti-gender movement. Under gender as a concept, we have examples such as the resistance to the Istanbul Convention in Poland and Bulgaria, but also attacks against gender studies worldwide. For LGBTQI rights, we see efforts such as Slovakia and Hungary introducing regressive definitions of marriage in their constitutions in 2014 and 2011. We also have Lemani Futus, which fits here. On SRHR, we have massive resistance globally, but also the increased targeting of African states by US evangelical NGOs who have been either organizing raids and social media attacks against abortion clinics, or we have the problem of NGOs who provide sexual and reproductive health being largely dependent on US funding and are therefore subject to the global gag rule and the possibility of it coming back with the change of administration in the US, which results in situations where only wealthy women actually have access to proper sexual and reproductive care. Next slide, please. We in terms of the narratives that the anti-gender movement deploys, we have identified 6 groups of narratives. Those are the naturalistic and religious narratives, fear-mongering and save the children, framing the anti-gender discourse as scientific discourse, the idea of competing human rights, the idea that gender equality has already been achieved, and the idea that gender is a colonial import or totalitarian ideology. Here I will focus on 2 in the presentation due to time constraints. The first one is the naturalistic or religious narratives, which is a very common trope. And the concept behind it is the assumption that the patriarchy is natural and normal. And examples include ideas that link women with motherhood or ideas that emphasize a heterosexual cis nuclear family as the fundamental unit of society, focusing on biology then and arguing that gender or the pro-gender is destabilizing to it. And here the anti-gender movement has a narrative advantage because they promote ideas that are seen and understood as traditional and normal within society. So this enables these actors to use their narratives to advocate for what are essentially human rights violations, for example. Under the group of fear-mongering or save the children narratives, we have the example, for instance, in Russia, how the anti-gay propaganda law was adopted with the reasoning that it aimed at protecting children from information promoting the denial of traditional family values. In Bulgaria, the strategy for children 2019-2030 was dismissed because of a lot of disinformation, largely linked to the fear of parents about their children. And in making this argument, it's important just to note that it would be misleading to say that parents themselves, exposed to one story only, are not genuinely concerned about the well-being of their own children. This is more a critique of government failure often to defend and explain properly the policies that are being proposed. Next slide, please. On the strategies, we have identified 10 groupings of strategies that are being used. These are community organizing and marches, disinformation campaigns, the harassment of progressive activists or instrumentalizing defectors, seizing state power, either directly or through lobbying, engaging or disrupting policy-making processes at the international level, secularizing discourse, adopting rights-based language, legislative and legal challenges to policies aimed for equality, and funding or defunding. And again, I will focus on 2 due to time constraints. The first one I would like to zoom into is this seizing state power, either directly or through lobbying, which aims at positioning anti-gender actors in or close to positions of power, state power, which grants them access to the resources of the state to change both policy and opinion domestically and internationally. In Mexico, for example, the intention to take the state is consecrated in the Santa Fe Declaration, in which representatives of several anti-rights groups from all over the Americas and Spain participated in, and they explicitly stated that it was necessary to create new political parties or increase their presence in pre-existing parties in their interest of a pro-family agenda. In other countries like Germany and Spain, parties like the AfD and Vox have picked up anti-gender discourse and are entrenching it within mainstream political discourse. And in some places like Brazil and the United States, evangelicals have been appointed to key roles related to gender issues or are very close to the governing elite. So this is Michael Pence's appointment as Vice President of the United States during the Trump administration is particularly illustrative. The other strategies that I would zoom into are challenging norms. And here we have 2 types of strategies. One is the defensive strategies, which would include proposing pro-family language to modify the meaning of text, or introducing positive language that allows parties more flexibility in how they interpret or implement obligations. Also requesting to delete inflexible language or adding language that will minimize the negative outcomes of mandates handed to UN agencies or treaty bodies. We also have offensive strategies, which is introducing anti-gender language actively. This could be blanket opposition against a range of SRHR issues through resolutions aiming to protect the family, or introducing new thematic resolutions linked to SRHR topics, but without SRHR language. These approaches then aim to construct a positive infrastructure of treaties and legal documents that support anti-gender views. Next slide, please. And so what can be done, having seen like who the actors are, what their narratives and strategies are? We have identified 7 policy areas for action. One is taking the threat by the anti-gender campaign seriously and building internal capacities. And here we'd like to point out specifically the recommendation to internally and externally reframe the work of anti-gender campaigns as organized, well-funded attacks on human rights of political minorities and liberal democracy, and not a pushback that needs to be contextualized within the wider attacks on democracy and multilateralism globally. The second policy area of action is ensuring credible allyship for gender equality. And for instance, this could mean introducing science-based comprehensive sexuality education in schools and ensuring the curriculum reflects best practices on introducing children and adolescents to sexuality and diversity in an age-appropriate manner. The third area of action is widening and strengthening alliances. And here that could look like working towards the establishment of a pro-gender EU Council preparatory body, or as an alternative, an informal task force, politically and financially supporting the work of bodies such as the high-level group of non-discrimination, equality and diversity, or the expert group of social determinants and health inequalities. The next policy area of action is strengthening outreach and improving communication. So this could look like anticipating opposition by anti-gender actors when rolling out new policies related to gender equality, both domestically and internationally, accompanying new policies on the issues of the rights of women and LGBTQI people with substantial public communication campaigns explaining and justifying these policies, partnering with civil society in these campaigns, but not leaving it up to civil society to defend government policies when they're being attacked. The next policy area of action is strengthening cooperation with and financially supporting civil society. And this can look like financially supporting civil society to conduct political advocacy work promoting gender equality and providing much needed support to women and LGBTQI communities on the ground, with the understanding that addressing the symptoms of gender equality is as important as civil society's ability to shape political and public discourse. This could also look like providing long-term institutional and easy to administer funding for feminist and LGBTQI organizations, especially grassroots organizations, including loosely organized movements, ensuring that at least 50% of funds earmarked for gender equality actually goes to feminist grassroots and civil society organizations, including trans and LGBTQI organizations, and not international organizations or other governments. Then the next policy area of action would be investing political capital and advancing gender equality internationally, which could look like proactively and regularly organizing high-level events on the topic of anti-gender campaigns in or at the margins of important international gatherings such as the UN General Assembly, ideally in cooperation with other like-minded states, highlighting the threats posed by anti-gender campaigns to human rights of political minorities and democracy in speeches, statements, and on social media. And finally, it's the last area of action is supporting activities and research that increase the
It looks like we've lost Damian.
to support the call for an urgent investigation into the funding sources of US Christian rights.
Sorry, Damian, you were just cut off for a second. Maybe you can just repeat the last sentence.
Sorry, yeah, so just the last policy of action, supporting activities and research that increase the understanding of anti-gender campaigns in specific contexts, which could look like specifically investigating which external actors are influencing policies and narratives in the European context. And the first step to doing this would be, in line with the calls by more than 50 MEPs, would be to support the call to do an urgent investigation into the funding sources of US Christian right groups, which has spent over at least 50 million in Europe over the last decade. And an investigation should also be conducted into the compatibility of these organizations with EU law, EU fundamental rights, and European values. Next slide, please. And so to summarize those the key takeaways that we would like to leave you with from the study so far, it's not a pushback, but it's a highly organized, while not centralized, well-funded and transnational movement that is both a manifestation and reinforcement of anti-democratic trends, and the shrinking space for civil society organization is specifically harmful to the rights of women and LGBTQI people. Anti-gender actors are hugely diverse, do not always share the same ideological framework, and the concept of gender ideology serves as symbolic glue to bind them together. And finally, advancing the rights of women and LGBTQI people requires governments to commit resources and the willingness to challenge and confront anti-gender actors and enable feminist civil society to challenge patriarchal and racist structures. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Damian, for this tour de force through our study. Obviously, this was a lot, but you can all read it up on our website. I just shared the link in the chat. And as I said, you can also start with the executive summary and or the key takeaways before you dive into volume 1 and volume 2 of our study. Now we want to focus on Hungary and Brazil to also understand a bit better of how this actually looks in specific contexts. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our two experts, Bea and Denise. Bea is the legal program director at Hatta Society, which is the largest and oldest currently operating LGBTQI organization in Hungary. And Bea, you've been working on women's rights and LGBTQI rights and human rights for more than 20 years now. You've also worked as an equal opportunity expert in the field of LGBTQI rights for the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor, and you participated in the work of the Committee of Experts on Discrimination on Grounds of Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity of the Council of Europe, and you contributed to drafting recommendations on measures to combat discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Denise Herrao is an independent consultant specialized in human rights with over 20 years of professional experience. She's currently based in Berlin, but she has worked extensively in on sexual and reproductive rights and health globally, having held positions at the UN Population Fund in Brazil and at the International Women's Health Coalition in New York. Prior to that, she headed the Human Rights Unit of Sao Paulo State Justice Department and litigated in the field of public law. Thank you so much for being with us today. I would like to start right away because also we want to give participants some time to ask questions. Firstly, Bea, I would like to start with you. In our study, we actually reflect on how in Hungary, anti-gender actors are not only part of the current government, but are really the core of the current government. Can you elaborate on this and help us understand how the anti-gender campaigns manifest themselves in Hungary and how this actually impacts your work as a civil society activist?
Yes, thank you and welcome all. While listening to Damian's presentation on your study, I was imagining what I'm going to say about our work and the situation in Hungary as a series of snapshots, basically illustrating what you found in your study. So whatever Damian talked about as strategies, narrative employed, we can really see Hungary as a case study where it's not only actors that are independent of the government that employ it, but really the government that is basically seizing the state. I work in an LGBTQI organization, as Junina has told in your kind introduction. And we operate a legal aid service. So what we know and what we work with are all sorts of data and information coming into our organization's think tanks through service provision, a legal aid service, through our advocacy work, and through trainings for both the LGBTI community and professionals. And we've been doing this work for ages. Hatter was founded in 1995. 25 years ago. And I can say that until like 2010, working for LGBTI equality meant a lot of work, but it felt like working in an emerging sector. And then something happened. The new government, our government, came into power in 2010. And from then on, it's obvious that there's no legal improvement to be expected. No, we cannot expect any action towards legal and social equality to be realized in Hungary. But what you found in your study, the discourses that you describe, really started 5 to 6 years ago in the mid 2010s, when the first bad sign was a smear campaign against several different various civil society actors, organizations. There were also investigations launched, and they were all labeled as serving foreign interests. And even a new legislation came into power, really based on a Russian model, I'd say, that we all have to put on our publications that all organizations that are so-called foreign-funded organizations, and the EU, which we are part of, is also tagged as a foreign instance. So especially those organizations, feminist, women's rights organizations, and LGBTI organizations that had never got any home funding, which rely on different donors from foundations to the European Union, the European Commission, are especially affected by this. Actually, the European Court of Justice ruled that this was against EU norms and legislation, but that doesn't really have an impact on the Hungarian government. The next step that was a bad sign, and where we could see how the government deploys narratives, was its very severe anti-migrant, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic campaign at the same time, when war refugees came not really into Hungary but through Hungary. And at that time we could see how they use their rhetoric and narrative techniques to create the other, the foreign, what is against so-called Hungarian interests. And then really soon afterwards, when this campaign that was run actually all throughout the Hungarian media, all state-ruled channels, radio channels, TV channels, which means basically the media that people can have access to, most of it, then they began to suddenly turn the direction and first began to test their message through attacking the Istanbul Convention, still a faraway subject for many ordinary people in Hungary, saying that it's that they have to step up against it. Because it contains the word gender, and then the demonization of the concept of gender began, which led then to even a parliamentary resolution saying that we will never, that the Hungarian state is not going to ratify the Istanbul Convention. Then it continued with closing gender departments, which still it didn't really impact so many people, but they could test their polarizing tactics. They always dropped in something that divided the community. They could say that only those are affected by these who are with the enemy, with the other, who are with the foreign agents or the foreign influencers in Hungary. So they simply stopped closed gender departments. The ongoing students could finish their studies, but there's no gender studies anymore in the country. And then they turned all these the machinery and weapon arsenal that had been by that time developed during these actions, then turned against mostly the LGBTI community during the last year. First, they talked about adoption as something horrible, that same-sex couples can adopt children, and that should be stopped. Actually, they could not adopt as couples, but as individuals, but at least as individuals it was possible. That's not possible anymore. And also completely unexpectedly during the COVID crisis, when the COVID crisis hit Hungary last spring, they banned legal gender recognition. It's a complete ban. Everybody has a birth sex that needs to be registered when the baby is only 6 weeks old, and then it can never ever be changed. So it really strictly affects intersex children and trans people, adult trans people. And it all goes under the heading of protecting children. They even actually changed the constitution. So now the constitution contains that, and this is really to show again with a photo, a snapshot of how far it can go. The constitution now contains, besides the usual children's protection legislation that says that children's right to physical, psychological, and moral development should be defended by the state. It now says that that Hungary defends the right to their identity based on their birth sex, quite meaningless, and that Hungary provides education based on our constitutional identity, whatever that means, and Christian culture. So it really, you can really see how a religious toned and very a narrative that is setting us and them and really defines being Hungarian in a really exclusionary way. And we can now see, a legal aid service now can see the impacts. We get complaints from parents, from schools. Children are attacked in schools. For the last example is that a couple of children dressed for a school event as human rights activists, and some of them had rainbow flags, and they were investigated against by the school directorate, and it's still ongoing. And also consumer protection authorities fine actors like industries like Coca-Cola, or civil society organizations that published a fairy tale book containing a few LGBT characters, also very different various characters, or the German founded television channel RTL Club is now also has a process, an ongoing legal process by a consumer protection authority, because they let on they show their a family is family campaign that included that included information on same-sex parenting. And it was broadcasted before 9 p.m. And again, so all these consumer protection arguments say that they use the argument that these are against moral values of the children, and that the protection of children needs these steps. So this is what we are in now, in a society that is more and more divided, with a stronger and stronger state. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bea, for outlining what these strategies and narratives that we've outlined, actually what it means and how it can look like in the practice. So thank you for the work that you do, I think, most importantly. And we're looking forward to maybe finding ways of working together and supporting each other. Denise, now over to Brazil. In the case study that is being published as part of the volume 2, you in particular analyze the anti-gender campaigns and the rise of President Bolsonaro to power and his presidential campaign. And you highlight the interlinkages between the anti-gender campaigns and authoritarianism in Brazil. Can you maybe elaborate on this a bit and help us understand why we need to look at these interlinkages?
Thank you, Nina. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's been a pleasure to work with the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy in this study. So the question about the interlinkages between anti-gender and right-wing populists. I'd say the main link between them is ideology. And especially when it comes to far-right populists, an anti-gender agenda is often at the center of their political platform. Now, when it comes to right-wing populists, and even to some left-wing populists, as Damien noted, this can be part of their ideology, but they might embrace it because it's strategic. So ideology and strategy are the two dimensions that I would like to discuss. And I'm going to do that for the sake of time, just by sharing 3 examples with you from my home country, Brazil, which unfortunately would offer you a million of other examples. And that is because, as Nina said, our president, Jair Bolsonaro, is a far-right politician with a very clear anti-gender agenda. And so my first example takes us back to 2014, before his election. At that moment, Brazil was adopting a national education plan. And anti-gender advocates managed they were successful in removing the words gender equality from that plan, from an education plan. They used the term gender ideology, so they removed the words gender equality, and they used for that the concept of gender ideology, which Damien addressed in his presentation as well. Similar to that, they were also successful in stopping the Ministry of Education from implementing an anti-homophobia program at schools. And they said that, and they pictured this program as a program that would teach kids to become homosexuals. They were successful in that regard as well. So some things had been tested before the campaign, before the presidential campaign. And that's my second example. In 2018, Bolsonaro's presidential campaign, it reflected models of masculinity that exalted authoritarianism, violence, sexism, racism, and homophobia. And it took advantage of that type of situation to create factoids, to forge battles, and thus craft his image. And exactly as Damian presented in our, and we also heard in the opening remarks, social media was key for that. And through a lot of fake news, often related to gender, that appeared in, that were spread widely through social media, especially through WhatsApp messages, because this is a private social network. And the goal here was to feel emotions. This type of tactic of feeling emotions through social network platforms is a strategy that is often said to be inspired in Steve Bannon's tactics in the United States. So here again, another international connection. Now, my third example took place last year, and it is an international document that was signed by 32 countries with basically anti-gender content. So we are talking about 32 members of the United Nations coming together to prepare a document against gender equality that included, if you look at the list of the countries, you would see that most of them are either dictatorships or they are led by very authoritarian regime leaders. Yeah, the topic of populism, again, I would like to focus on that because and using this term, the definition of this term as fascism on a democratic key. This can be, you can picture what an authoritarian regime with an anti-gender and a far-right agenda looks like, with very straight facts from Brazil that I would like to list. Jair Bolsonaro has been in power in Brazil for only 2 years and has already led the country to such a catastrophic situation in which over 2,000 people die of COVID every day, in which the number of state-perpetrated killings have reached war levels. The Amazon forest has been destroyed at an unprecedented fast pace, and democracy has been destroyed from within. The number of persecutions and harassment, the number of cases of persecution and harassment against journalists, especially women journalists, against human rights advocates. We have some sexual and reproductive rights advocates who had to flee the country in political exile already. This has been extremely common. Regulations curtailing access to safe abortion. Few cases that in which abortion is legal in Brazil have been adopted by the country. And I could continue listing, the number of feminicides is increasing, and I could continue listing forever. But this is a bit of a picture of the type of a catastrophic situation that you can get to with a far-right anti-gender government with an authoritarian feature as well. And this is obviously extremely a threat for Brazilians, but it's also a threat for the world. And that is because at a minimum, it can serve as an example. But it's also a concern because of all the transnational bonds that you all described before me. Because these groups share resources, they share strategies, and once in power, they can they can influence even the world order. So it's a tragedy what we see in Brazil. Hope when we see this type of study being conducted. So thank you for having me here today. hope this helps share a bit of the experience in Brazil.
Thank you, Denise, for these very clear, albeit shocking words, but I think it's important that we also face the facts. And for everyone else who's interested to read more on the Brazilian case, Brazil is one of the case studies written by Denise of our study in volume 2. Now with the panelists, I would like to ask one more question to each of you, but for the participants, if you have questions, please already think about them, raise your hand or drop them already in the chat, and then I can pick them up already. Bea, I would like to focus a bit on looking forward, because you, as part of your work, you also try to disrupt the gender ideology discourse. And I would like to know from you, what do you think governments, European governments, but also institutions like the EU, for example, could do in order to support your work better? What has proven useful in the past? What hasn't? What should they stop doing? What do you recommend?
It's really difficult to answer with the government that is bases its discourse on being anti-EU, even though it is part of the European Union. So basically, I think that all channels are useful, even the channels that we don't know of, informal channels, bringing these issues up in discussions so that they know that there's because if they get criticism that is public, then they immediately jump on it publicly, saying that, listen, you see, we are attacked. So it's a narrative tactic that they use to basically encourage their supporters, or to keep together their supporters. Probably sometimes it's both formal and informal channels that are very useful. And we are also right now we can say that we are helped. We get funding for especially projects that target focus on building coalition and campaigning, and these are all sort of new activities for us. It's because Hungarian civil society organizations that provide services, legal aid, for example, are relatively young. They could also start after the 1990s, and rather in the early 20s. We've been working on legal advocacy trainings and service provision, legal aid service provision, more than campaigning. And now it's really a task for us, but also for the international community to support, that we have to study how to campaign, how to raise our voice together and inform people against this massive attack, because it's really massive, because it's not from other civil society organizations, other actors, even from actors like churches. It's the state that is constantly communicating. So we really need to reach out to at this point, when, for example, when we can see from a couple of months that the government's tactic is really to involve people through fear mongering and a sort of a propaganda directed at parents and teachers and schools. What we have to do, and I think it's really an imperative, it's an obligation, that we have to talk to parents and teachers and schools, so that they know that there are other sources of information, there are other views, other visions of society than what is stoned or seems to be kind of cemented in the Hungarian constitution. So we need research to base our actions, but also to study campaign tactics, and not only channels, but also framing. We need to somehow create actions and discourses that step into this polarization effect, because otherwise we remain closed in a system based on the government, the values that the government propagates. So basically all action, all informal, formal support are really useful.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, thank you so much for in particular highlighting using internal channels to also push for change and criticize. And I think this is also a point that Damian raised in the presentation that is really important for us, that progressive governments and also progressive civil society organizations need to be prepared to also offend anti-gender actors. We will not have this discussion when we're not willing to take the stand. And I think it's also important, obviously, to also do this behind the scenes to also enable a discussion. But I think we need to be aware that will not be an easy discussion to have. And I think also on the advocacy, again, Damian also raised it in the presentation, but we reflect on it a bit more in our study, is that the right wing and the anti-gender actors are really good in enabling grassroots civil society actors, but also civil society in general, to shape public and political discourse. Whereas the progressive side focuses a lot on or enabling civil society to treating the symptoms and not so much on shaping political discourse. And I think this is a mismatch which we need to address. And also on raising awareness. And I think these are also recommendations that we've picked up on the study, and actually having campaigns about why we need still work for gender equality, and also accompany new laws, new UN security resolution with campaigns and explaining why we need it to raise the awareness of it. Denise, same question to you. What do you think international governments should do to support civil society and academic researchers in Brazil?
Well, I think that the support needs to come to the people who are at the forefront, and that is women and LGBTQI people. The type of these groups, civil society organizations, for example, feminist civil society organizations, for example, they have already been operating with very scarce resources for many years. They bloomed in the 90s, but then they stopped getting as much support afterwards. And they continued, they persevered, because they are comprised of extremely courageous and committed women who continued the work despite the lack of resources. And now they continue the work despite of harassment and persecution. But can you imagine how hard it is to do this work with little resources and increasing threats? So, and the CSOs are important because they help lead, they advocate at decision-making spheres, and they also weave all the networks of resistance that take place in the country. And I had actually thought so they need support in various ways. They need support in funds, definitely, and a lot. They need support in other types of resources, and they also need solidarity, international visibility, international solidarity, taking part in creating new networks or enhancing the networks that exist internationally are all important of support. And also understanding that what happens in Brazil is, as many people said, everything is interconnected. So the fact that democracy is eroding takes place at the same time as sexual and reproductive rights becomes fragilized and at the same time, so that I'm sorry, I'm disorganized my presentation now. But so the everything is interconnected. So racism, sexism, homophobia, all the hate speech that came with the government, and all the policies that also came together with it, they have the same type of consequences. If you ask, for example, a Black woman, a woman from Black women organizations in Brazil, they say that their main problem in sexual and reproductive rights, many people say, and I'm saying, is actually the situation of what they call a genocide against Black people in Brazil. And the fact that the Bolsonaro's government flexibilized access to gun, eases the access, has been adopting many resolutions to stop gun control. This has an impact to that. The hate speech, it also has an impact to that, or speech that actually condone or even praise police brutality has an impact to it and has an impact on women. So support to organizations working on freedom of speech, the topic of racism, working on, but then particularly women's organizations and LGBTQI organizations is fundamental. Now, I just wanted to tell you that it's really important to think that resistance is also happening at all levels. It happens at the grassroots level when, for example, a group of transgender women in the Amazon region gets together to create protection systems for each other so that they can remove a person under threat, that threat from one place and go to and move her to another place. When feminist CSOs are advocating at Congress and managing to bar the advances of anti-gender Congress people. When the fact that Marielle Franco, this woman who was a member of the city council in Rio de Janeiro, when her murder inspired a lot of Black women across the country to enter politics. And last year in October 2020, many of them were elected at the local level. It's a small number still, but it brings hope, definitely. So and finally, I wanted to say that this has a tremendous potential, and this can be seen by the fact that right before Bolsonaro's election, hundreds of thousands of women went to the streets under the hashtag Not Him, Ele Não, denouncing the fact that that was an extremely dangerous candidacy at many levels, including regarding sexism and homophobia. And then if you look at the results of the election, taking just young people, but if young people decided the elections, young women decided the elections, the elections by 20%. So it really makes sense to invest in women. Thanks.
That's a really good note to end on, Denise. Yeah, thank you. And I think what you've highlighted, that everything is connected, I think this is really important. And I can just share from CFFP's perspective that moving forward, the next, or building on the study, that we're working mainly with a focus on Europe, obviously, because we're a Germany-based organization, but we want to strengthen the synergies between feminist and LGBTQI organizations and those organizations that work to defend our democratic values, because we think obviously together we are stronger. Now we have a couple of questions, and I've tried to all write them down. I would like, in interest of time, to just give each of you a couple of questions, and then we see how far we get. Damian, there were a couple of questions on how the pandemic enabled anti-gender actors to regroup or to be stronger. Could you say something about this? And also about, there were a question about what could be the glue for the progressive actors, so those working for women's rights, for LGBTQI rights, for democratic values. What could be the glue for those actors so that we all come together a bit better? And then Bea, there was a specific question for you, what academics could do and what kind of research is actually necessary. Maybe you can pick up on this. And then there was also a question on academic freedom, how the situation of academic freedom is and how it interlinks with anti-gender. So maybe Denise, given that you're also a researcher, maybe you can elaborate on this. And then I will do my best to address the question on the EU and the interlinkages of progressive actors and right-wing actors. Damian, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. So I'll start with the issue of COVID. So the COVID pandemic has impacted obviously the rights of women and LGBTQI in multiple ways, and they're from reinforcing existing gender inequalities and the fact that women are disproportionately affected by the pandemic because they make the majority of the healthcare sector workforce. Offline and online gender-based violence has also increased, and the pandemic has led to this retraditionalization of gender relations in the private sphere, and the gender care gap is also widening. At the same time, anti-gender actors have used the pandemic to reinforce their narratives, and in many countries, in particular the United States, the pandemic is used was used as a political opportunity to restrict women's access to reproductive services by declaring them non-essential, and this happened in other countries as well. In Germany, we had critique against gender studies being said that there is not enough money to finance research into vaccines because gender studies have been overfunded, and this was a pointless way of spending money. So these kinds of connections have also been made by the anti-gender movement in the context of the pandemic. And finally, we see the governments using the pandemic as an opportunity to augment their power and limit civil society liberties and rights, which means that also there's fewer people and fewer possibilities to advocate and to defend and protect these rights. So in the context in which anti-gender actors are in power, this has been particularly detrimental within the context of COVID-19, and it has in a way strengthened the anti-gender movement or provided enough space for them to expand. I think on the second question of what could be the glue holding holding us together kind of on the progressive side, it would be the understanding, I think finally, that all of these rights are interconnected and they fall kind of as a domino. So the issue that holds us together is the space for civil society to advocate and defend rights, which is crucial there, and also the democratic ability to participate in the decision making of which policies are made in our context. So by linking these issues together and by identifying or by realizing that none of us can be free until everybody is free, this would be, for me at least, the kind of the glue that should hold us together, and understanding that until we stop working in silos, we will not be able to go beyond treating the symptoms and actually address the root cause.
Thank you so much. Bea, what kind of research is necessary?
Yes, we are trying to find out what kind of research is necessary. We are actually working on research, and it's and because it's only for a couple of months, and we chose the subjects and the methodology because we think that this is what is necessary. We want to see what motivates people in really believing what these narratives propagated by the government say, because it's not an empty space that the government talks into. It's not just that they use all their state power and media and television channels. They are voted for. So even if it's not the majority, but still they get enough votes to get to preserve their power in the parliament for the last 10, 11 years now. So we really need to look into what values people think are important, and why the threat, why fear mongering, why how we can argue that this threat narratives should not be so powerful. We saw a Polish study, for example, in which it turned out that young men, especially men between 20 and 30, are much more afraid of the impact of so-called gender propaganda organizations, much more afraid of this impact than unemployment or the impacts of climate change. So how it really works in people's minds, what makes them, what are the value systems that they base their thinking upon, and why these messages of fear mongering are so effective. So we study through representative surveys, through interviews and focus groups, how people relate to different values, what is their trust like in democratic institutions, so that we can build our own narratives and find the best frames and channels to talk to them on kind of putting things into a realistic perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I think these are all really good ideas, and hopefully will be picked up. And maybe I can just add one point on research. In the case study on the US, the two authors actually highlight that the positions by the Republican Party, for example, on abortion but also on the rights of LGBTQI people, are not in line with the views of the majority of the Americans. And I think to also highlight this, that the majority of people, I think it's actually the same in Germany, the majority of people favor the legalization of abortion, but we have certain parties that are in power who then proclaim something others. So I think it's also important to have this research and actually what people think and what they want in order to also call out politicians that they are not representing the public opinion. Denise, on the academic freedom in Brazil and interlinkages to anti-gender actors.
Thanks. Yeah, so the person who asked this question even mentioned one example from Brazil of Bolsonaro, the president, interfering in the election of rectors of the presidents of some universities, public universities, federal universities. So this is just a very small example, just to list a few of how they do that. I think the most outrageous one was a call for proposals launched by the Ministry of Culture that called for proposals that basically rewrite history in a certain way that is aligned to their views of history, which actually distorts everything. But that launch was particularly appalling because it was done with this, not the minister, it was the Secretary of Culture who did a video using a speech by Goebbels. And I think for the German audience, it can be in particular, anyway, I think for any of us, this is really appalling. He ended up being fired, but the policy continues. And the other way that they are pressuring academics is by public funds. Brazil has several institutions that fund public federal public institutions that fund research, and then they are influencing these funds definitely with a lot of content, anti-gender content. Then a third example is monitoring some professors. So some professors who are outspoken can by official institutions, and also they are using some systems that are democratic systems that were created for democratic purposes, for transparency, for control of the public administration, to establish, to stop, to diminish the freedom of speech of these professors, and also even public prosecutor office and judiciary, judges and prosecutors who are in line with the far right views, also taking measures against some professors. And what I would say is that this also shows how if democratic systems are fragile, then this type of push is a lot harder to defend from. So, for example, if the university, a public university, needs to be autonomous, for example, the judiciary, the public prosecutor office, and other institutions that could intervene. I mean, being that the person, a professor being harassed, for example, could resort to, if they are working well, then this type of push can be protected to a certain extent. So if the media is actually free and can cover these facts, then society can respond to that. So I just wanted to say that democratic underpinnings are all connected as well. And in Brazil, we have one example that is about sexual and reproductive health and rights. Advocates and professors in this field being so harassed that they have to flee the country, especially if you talk about abortion, for example.
Thank you, Denise, for highlighting the interlinkages. We are all, unfortunately, we're already out of time, so I try my best in 1 minute to respond to the outstanding questions. But I just want to reassure all of you that we'll continue to work on this, and we'll continue to have events, and we'll appreciate you reaching out and contacting us, and we're really looking forward to advancing the debate. The last question was on if we have explanation between the mismatch of public opinion and the positions of politicians. I would say it's clearly that they're not about gender, but as we've said, it's about advancing their own agenda, their power, their ideas of society. So it has nothing to do with actually what people believe, but what they want and what they benefit from. There was a question on how progressive anti-gender actors work and right-wing actors, how they work together. And in the study, we elaborate on two examples, I think. For example, right-wing actors use so-called defectors, so people who have been in the past pro-choice activists or who in the past have advocated for trans rights, and then basically pretend that they had a wakening up and now they've understood how it worked and now they're against abortion or against trans rights. That is one way of how they work together. And how we can counter this, obviously, I think it's really difficult, but I think if engagement is possible, I would relate to what Damian has said before, that we need to raise awareness that will not destroy patriarchy if we enable cis heterosexual women to be in position of powers and to shape political discourses, but we will not succeed, and this should not be our goal. So I think this is the narrative that we should employ in order to foster engagement in this regard. And then there was one regard on the EU and how should EU states react to EU member states who refuse to accept certain resolutions or certain documents. And I think we've seen this in the EU, we've seen it in the UN Security Council, we've seen it in the OSCE, for example. And I think one of the biggest recommendations that we have is for the progressive actors to early on strategize together and have a plan on how to push wording on gender equality or on sexual health and reproductive health and rights. Because what we've seen, if for example the resolution is not per se on gender, but it's for example on small arms and light weapons, there is a tendency to leave the gender paragraph until the end, and then it's being negotiated out. And actors like Russia, for example, they use the gender wording because they know that the progressive states will want it in, so they use it as a bargaining chip. And I think if we early on strategize in not letting it become a bargaining chip, and also in early on coordinating with civil society and bringing them on board, so that we can raise awareness together, have the same narratives, this could also be a way out. I will leave it here. Thank you so much for staying with us. And we're looking forward to seeing many of you soon again. And thank you so much for Denise and Bea, and obviously to the German Federal Foreign Ministry and the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs for their support. Have a good rest of the day and see you soon.